The next morning, Clara awoke in Elias McGraw's ranch house, though it felt like waking inside a tomb. The walls were thick log beams, the floor strong, the hearth wide, yet everything bore the dust of years unlived. Furniture sat where it had always been, as if untouched since his wife's passing. A faded shawl lay across the back of a chair, brittle with age. On the mantel stood a child's wooden rattle, carved with care but never used. Clara stood there, her hand hovering just above it, her breath caught. She understood now why the man had come to her. His home was a shrine, frozen in grief, and he needed someone brave enough to move within its silence. Elias himself was already at work before dawn, driving cattle through snow. She saw him through the window, a mountain of a man, shoulders hunched against the wind, his breath steaming in the air. There was something both fearsome and tender about the sight, how he shouldered every burden alone. Clara felt a strange pull, not of desire, but of recognition. She too knew the weight of being mocked, of being alone, of walking with a hollow that no one could see. She began her work quietly. The first day she scrubbed the hearth until it gleamed, letting firelight dance upon the stones. She baked bread that filled the air with warmth no candle could rival. She found broken hinges, torn curtains, and mended them with steady hands. It wasn't just labor, it was an offering, her way of answering the plea he had spoken, to bring life back into walls gone cold. Elias said little. When he returned that evening, snow still clinging to his boots, he paused at the door. His gaze swept across the room, and though he said nothing, Clara saw something flicker across his eyes. Perhaps surprise, perhaps relief. He took his seat at the table, and she set before him a plate of stew, steam curling upward. He bowed his head slightly, murmured a wordless thanks, and began to eat. The silence might have broken another woman, but Clara had lived among silences all her life. Instead, she filled it gently, humming as she moved, asking simple questions about the cattle, the land. At first his answers were short, clipped. But as days grew into weeks, his words lengthened. He told her about the storm that had once wiped out half his herd. About the mare in the barn who had carried him since he was 20. About the day he buried his wife beneath the cottonwood tree on the hill. His voice did not waver, but Clara heard the fracture beneath it. The townsfolk, of course, noticed her absence from her cabin. And whispers began again, sharper than before. The barren midwife, living with a widower. Shameful. Some muttered she had come to steal his land. Others sneered that she'd finally found a man desperate enough to keep her. Clara heard their voices when she ventured into town for flour or salt, their eyes burning into her back. Yet when she returned to the ranch, the sight of Elias working beside his herd, the sound of his heavy boots on the porch, was enough to quiet their sting. One evening, as she mended a shirt by lamplight, Elias stood watching her. His arms were crossed, his face shadowed by firelight. "They talk about you, don't they?" he asked quietly. Clara froze, needle in hand. Then she nodded. "They always have." For a long moment he said nothing, then stepped closer. "Let them. I know what you've given this place already. You brought warmth where there was none. You brought me back to a table I hadn't sat at in years. That is worth more than their wagging tongues." His words struck her deeper than she expected, for they were not flattery. They were truth, spoken by a man who did not waste breath. She bowed her head, swallowing the sudden sting in her eyes. Winter lingered cruelly, but, within the ranch walls, warmth slowly took root. They worked in rhythm. He in the fields, she in the home, both meeting at dusk with tired bodies and quiet satisfaction. Some nights he would sit by the fire, telling stories of the early days when the land was raw and wild, and she would listen, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes softening. Other nights, the silence was enough, each of them simply existing in the company of another soul who understood solitude. But not all shadows are so easily banished. One night, Clara woke to the sound of Elias crying out in his sleep. She rose from her bed and found him in the main room, hunched before the fire, his great frame trembling. His hands were buried in his hair, and his voice cracked as he whispered his wife's name into the flames. Clara stood in the doorway, her heart twisting. She wanted to comfort him, but she also knew grief was a wild beast, it could not be tamed, only endured. So she did the only thing she could. She stoked the fire, sat down across from him, and remained there in silence until dawn, letting him know he was not alone. And in that fragile light of morning, something shifted between them. He looked at her not as a stranger, not even as just a caretaker, but as a woman whose presence carried weight. a woman who had chosen to walk into his haunted home and not turn away. And Clara, though still mocked by the town, began to see herself differently too. For perhaps she had been denied children, denied the laughter of her own kin, but here, in this house of sorrow, she had been given another calling, to heal what even time could not. Spring came, soft and trembling on the edges of the prairie, but peace did not follow. Clara's place at Elias's ranch had become the talk of the town. At first, it was just whispers behind hands, women shaking their heads at her in church pews, men smirking when she passed by. But in the West, whispers had a way of hardening into stones, and soon enough those stones were being thrown. One morning, she found the fence post near the road carved with a cruel word, barren. Another time, a basket she left in the town square for a poor family was kicked over, the bread scattered in the dust. Elias noticed the changes in her face, the way her smile faltered when she thought he wasn't looking, the heaviness in her shoulders after she returned from town. He asked her once, "Did they trouble you much?" And she, always the one to bear wounds silently, answered, "I've been called worse before." Yet her voice broke a little at the end, and he knew it was not true. For Clara's strength was real, but strength was not the same as being unhurt. The breaking point came in early May, at the cattle market. Clara had gone with Elias, walking at his side though she kept her eyes down. The pens were crowded, the smell of manure and sweat thick in the air. As Elias haggled with a buyer, Clara lingered near a trough, waiting. That's when a woman she had once helped in childbirth, a woman who owed her life, sneered at her, loud enough for all to hear. Imagine taking advice on babies from a midwife who can't have her own. No wonder her womb's as empty as her name. Laughter rose like wildfire among the crowd. Clara froze, her cheeks burning, her eyes stinging. She could have walked away, as she always did. But Elias was there, and he heard every word. He turned, slow as thunder, and the market fell silent as the giant rancher's shadow loomed over the woman. His voice came out low, cold, carrying across the yard, "You'll bite your tongue before you speak of her again." The woman faltered, shrinking back. But one of the men chuckled bitterly. "You bought yourself a barren woman, McGraw. No son will carry your name now. All you got was another mouth to feed." The laughter returned, harsher this time, knives hidden in every sound. Elias stepped forward, towering above the man until the smirk bled off his face. "I didn't buy her," Elias growled, his voice a rumble that seemed to shake the dust itself. "I asked her to share my home because no one in this town had the sense to see her worth. And hear me now, if a single one of you so much as spits her name with venom again, you'll answer to me." His hand rested near his belt, where the glint of iron hung, and the crowd knew he meant it. Silence spread, broken only by the restless shifting of cattle. Clara, standing in the circle of his shadow, felt her heart thunder not with fear, but with something new, the fierce safety of being defended. They returned home without another word spoken. That night, as Clara washed the dishes, Elias sat at the table, staring into the fire. Finally he spoke, his voice thick, "I can't give you children, Clara. My wife died trying to bring one into this world, and I swore I'd never risk a woman that way again. But I'll give you this, a life where no one dares question your place. You've healed me more than you know." Clara turned, drying her hands on her apron, her throat tight. "And you gave me something I never thought I'd have again," she whispered. "A reason to be needed." Their eyes met in the flickering light, and for the first time since either of them had been left broken by life, they allowed themselves to smile, not from politeness or duty, but from something blooming that neither mockery nor sorrow could kill. As the seasons turned, Clara found her calling anew. Children she delivered began running up to her when she came to town, tugging at her skirts, calling her Aunt Clara. Women sought her not only as a midwife but as a counselor, a steady voice who carried no judgment. Slowly, the cruelty lost its teeth. And though whispers never fully died, they no longer mattered. For when people looked to the hill above the valley, where Elias's ranch stood strong against the horizon, they saw not a widower and a barren woman, but a pair who had defied the cruelty of the West simply by choosing to stand together. Years later, townsfolk would tell stories of Elias McGraw and Clara, the midwife. They'd say his ranch never starved because her hands kept it alive. They'd say he never raised his voice again at the market because no one dared tempt his wrath. And they'd say that though no children were born of her womb, dozens were born of her care, and in that way, she became mother to half the valley. For in the end, it wasn't sons or daughters that made her life full. It was the dignity given back to her by a man too broken to love again, until he found in her the same wound, the same courage, and the same will to begin anew. The years moved like slow rivers across the valley, carrying with them hardship, laughter, and the endless rhythm of the seasons. By the second autumn Clara spent on Elias's ranch, the land no longer felt foreign. The creak of the windmill, the lowing of cattle, the smell of fresh bread cooling on the windowsill, all had become the sounds of home. She often thought back to the lonely nights in her small cabin on the edge of town, when whispers branded her with shame. Now, when she lay awake listening to Elias's steady breathing beside her, she knew the whispers no longer owned her. The town, too, began to change, though not without friction. At first, women still eyed her with suspicion, resentful that a barren midwife had found a place at the side of the valley's most formidable rancher. But something softer grew in their hearts each time Clara appeared in the doorway during a birth, her steady hands guiding a new life into the world, her voice calm through the storm of pain. Even the harshest tongues grew hesitant to mock a woman who had saved their children. Elias remained a man of few words, but his presence in Clara's life was louder than any declaration. When the town's carpenter lost his wife during childbirth, Elias drove Clara through the night without hesitation. When cattle thieves crept into the valley, he rode them down with fire in his eyes, but always returned home first to Clara, as though no victory was complete without her smile. And when townsfolk came to ask advice on harvests, fences, or trade, Elias answered them with Clara by his side, as though her opinion bore as much weight as his own. Still, the West was never free of trial. A drought came, searing the land until even the hardiest cattle fell to dust. Water ran low, tempers ran high, and more than once men came to Elias's door begging for food. It was Clara who opened the granary and rationed what they had, her hands writing names in a ledger, her voice reminding each man that pride mattered less than survival. Later, when the drought broke, those same men said it wasn't Elias's herds that saved them, but Clara's wisdom. And though Elias never spoke of it, she caught him once tracing his rough thumb across her name in that ledger, as though memorizing it for all time. As the years passed, children grew, not hers, but hers all the same. They carried baskets of eggs to her porch, they ran across her pastures calling her name, they brought her flowers plucked from fields and tucked them behind her ear. She never corrected them when they called her, Ma Clara. It was a title she had once thought forever beyond her reach, yet it arrived not through blood, but through trust, care, and love. Elias aged, his hair silvering, his frame still massive but slowed. Clara watched him one evening as he mended a saddle by lantern light, his hands steady despite the years. She felt a swell of gratitude so sharp it brought tears to her eyes. "You gave me back my life," she whispered. He looked up, puzzled, and answered simply, "No, Clara. You gave me mine." That was his way, few words, but each one carrying the weight of mountains. The townsfolk who once mocked her began telling different stories. They said Elias McGraw was the fiercest rancher in the valley, but he bowed his head when Clara spoke. They said the West was cruel, but at the McGraw ranch, kindness ruled the land. They said that though Clara never bore a child, her heart birthed a family larger than any woman's womb could hold. One harsh winter, when snow buried the fences and storms howled for days, the ranch became a refuge. Families huddled in their barn, children slept under patched quilts by Clara's hearth, and Elias guarded the doors like a sentinel carved from stone. When spring finally came, no one who had survived that season ever spoke Clara's name with mockery again. They called her the Mother of the Valley, and the title stuck. When Elias's time came, for even giants fall, Clara stood at his grave beneath the cottonwoods, the wind carrying her hair like a veil. The whole valley gathered, from children she'd delivered to elders she'd nursed in their last days. She spoke softly, her voice trembling but strong enough to carry, "He gave me a home when I had none. And together, we gave each other back to life." Tears marked the faces of even the hardest cowhands. For in that moment, every soul in the valley knew that their world had been shaped not just by Elias's strength, but by Clara's courage to love when the world had mocked her. And when Clara herself grew old, her steps slower, her hands more fragile, the valley carried her as she had once carried them. The children, now grown with children of their own, built her fires, brought her food, and never let her be alone. She was no longer the woman mocked in whispers. She was the heart of the West itself, proof that even in the most unforgiving land, love and dignity could grow like wildflowers among the stones.